But during the 1830s and 1840s in Missouri and Illinois, the system was misused against Latter-day Saints. And in Utah in 1857, Isaac Haight was able to call out militiamen and send them to the Meadows to carry out the massacre. After the massacre, as I've already mentioned, many perpetrators said they had no choice but to participate. Though we can argue, as others have done, that the leaders deserved more blame than the followers, each man who took part in the massacre made several choices along the way about whether and how to participate or resist. Staub writes, "People who start with varying degrees of predisposition act increasingly destructively, changing along the way and contributing to the condition of an increasingly destructive system. This," he continues, "does not exclude responsibility. Along the way, there are many opportunities for choice. Unfortunately, choosing often takes place without awareness or conscious deliberation. Many choices are made without awareness, either preconsciously or unconsciously. Facing a conflict between a non-moral motive and a moral value, a person may reduce the conflict by moral equilibration, a shift to a different moral value or principle. For example," he writes, "the moral principles that prohibit killing or harming other human beings are replaced by a principle of social good, or loyalty and obedience to authority may become the relevant moral principles. As people progress along a continuum of destruction, moral equilibration becomes more automatic." Staub adds, "At the extreme, a complete reversal of morality may occur, so that murder becomes a service to humanity." When the orders to kill all of the besieged immigrants, including women and children, reached the Mountain Meadows early on the morning of September 11, 1857, there was some resistance at first. The resistance was quelled when leaders reduced the conflict by this shift to a different moral value that Staub describes. The treachery was rationalized as a defense of faith and hearth, and covering up what had already taken place. Have not these people threatened to murder our leader and prophet, and have they not boasted of murdering our patriarchs and prophets, Joseph and Hiram, a leader purportedly argued? If we let them go, went another argument, they will raise hell in California, and the result will be that our wives and children will have to be butchered, and ourselves too, and they are no better to die than ours. Again, after the massacre, those responsible, as well as some of their friends, relatives, and neighbors, sought to justify the deed as something that had to be done in order to protect the citizenry. Another occurrence along the continuum to mass killing is the use of euphemistic language, language that disguises or downplays a horrible reality. Euphemistic language plays a role in both planning out and carrying out of mass killings, as well as later attempts to justify them. Staub explains that bureaucratic compartmentalization and euphemistic language serve to deny reality and distance the self from violent actions and their victims. Denial of obvious reality, though it consumes much psychological energy, allows perpetrators to avoid feeling responsibility and guilt, and allows victims to avoid feeling dread. In the case of the massacre, some of the militiamen roped into participating reportedly received initial instructions telling them that they were being sent to Mountain Meadows to bury people who had already been killed. As Nephi Johnson explained, Isaac Haight told him that he had sent out a company of men with shovels to bury the dead, but when they got there, they would find something besides burying the dead awaited them. At the Meadows, shortly before the massacre, militia leaders euphemistically called their deceitful plan to lure the immigrants from their stronghold and then murder them a decoy. The women and children would simply be dispatched. After the massacre, some people referred to the atrocity by euphemisms such as the siege of Sebastopol. Finally, the victims themselves were deceived with smooth words into believing that they were being escorted to safety. In fact, they were being escorted to their deaths. Despite the wielding of enormous power, those who order mass killings cannot succeed without the cooperation of followers who actually carry out the destruction. Although, as I quoted Staub earlier, respect for authority and strong inclination to obedience are other predisposing characteristics for mass killing, the perpetrators who carry out mass killings play a role beyond that of blind obedience or even classic obedience to authority. Staub says, the relationship between leaders and followers in genocide or mass killing is not primarily a case of obedience to authority in the classic sense elucidated by the experiments of Stanley Milgram. Followers are not simply agents and their psychology agentic. Usually, he writes, followers join the leaders, and the direct perpetrators often unite with them in a highly authoritarian subsystem of society. In other words, despite protests later on about being forced into participating, many people who carry out mass killings exceed on the basis of some shared rationalization. Nephi Johnson, who played a key role in the massacre, left a statement that confirms Staub's point. Though he attempted to excuse some of the participants based on their relative youth and inexperience, Johnson still admitted that most of the men who took part in the killing also considered them, the immigrants, as their common enemies, and under the excitement caused by the advent of the approaching army, they felt partly justified in destroying them. One factor that makes it comparatively easy to move down the continuum of destruction is the powerful influence of the group. Staub writes, moral constraints are less powerful in groups than in individuals. There is a diffusion of responsibility in groups. Members often relinquish authority and guidance to the group and its leaders. He adds, belonging to a group makes it easier for people to act in ways that are out of the ordinary. At the same time, they can shed the inhibitions and limitations of individual identity. Anger and hate towards outsiders can come to the fore, especially when the group's beliefs promote these feelings. And they no longer need to take individual responsibility for their actions. No one is responsible, or the group is responsible, or the group's leaders. Powerful emotions, he writes, spread through contagion. In the case of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, such group thinking made it very difficult for the 4 or 5 dozen participants to resist. After the fact, some of the perpetrators said they had questions in their minds about what they were doing, but they were swept along with the group and its thinking, feeling almost powerless to resist. Even in a society that fosters individual moral responsibility, Staub explains, there is no guarantee that individuals will oppose the group. Resisting is extremely difficult. This last point brings me to one final reflection. I am acutely aware of how easy it is for students of the massacre like me to render judgment on those responsible for it. We did not live during the time in question, did not feel the emotions of that day, did not have the limited understanding or misunderstanding on which some of the leaders may have based their decisions. We enjoy the luxury of 20/20 hindsight and the quasi-omniscience of viewing events from an ivory tower much later. I recognize, too, that some people in the audience today, and certainly many who will read our forthcoming book on the massacre, will be related to and perhaps even descended from those whom I have named today as key decision makers or participants in the massacre. They may feel particular chagrin at such judgments. Let me therefore just urge, in conclusion, that when any of us make judgments on those who lived in the past, as we historians do at times, that we not do so with some overweening sense of superiority and condescension, but instead with a genuine desire to learn and to grow, to apply the lessons of the past to our lives in the present, with the hope of helping mankind eschew the human tendencies that lead to violence, tendencies that unfortunately remain tragically evident in our world today. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions.